Hey everybody, welcome back. So I just wanted to give us basically our last presentation here, and this one is less on stuff for the class necessarily. It's more just a little sort of epilogue to everything we've been talking about. Because in this last part of class, we've been looking at the European medieval world a lot. We've also been looking at things going on in the rest of the world during that same time period. So let's ask, how does this all to come to an end? I think that's a good note to end on. How does this all come to an end? And this isn't so much stuff to worry about for the test, although it's stuff to think about. But let's take a look. So we had this sort of stage that Europe was in, specifically what we call the Middle Ages, where things were a lot more rural, a lot less infrastructure, a lot less trade, and things like that. And a very specific culture based around Christianity and the knights and whatnot. How did that come to an end? Let's start there. Well, there are a lot of different reasons we can give for that. There's a lot of different answers we could give. One of them is a concept that may be familiar to all of us right now, which is the concept of disease. In Europe, in the 1300s, they experienced the Black Plague, also known as the bubonic plague, from the little sores that it makes appear on your body, which are called buboes. This was a big deal. So it was bad in the time of Justinian, but it was even worse in the 1300s, hundreds of years later, because it killed 30% of the population of Europe. This is pretty morbid to think about right now. But yeah, things can certainly be worse in historical terms. When 30% of the population dies off, when, 1 in 3 of the people in the continent are gone, that's a really big deal, which was probably around 100 to 2 million people. As you can imagine, this was pretty terrifying. In a lot of ways, it brought a certain time to an end. Um, it led to a lot of fear, a lot of crisis. People were trying to figure out, because this was a culture rooted in Christianity, in a lot of ways, or at least that was the dominant culture. What was going on? Had we done something wrong? Did God hate us? Some people said we need to be more obedient to God and we need to be better. Some people said God is just really angry all the time and that's just what God is like. This was a situation where there weren't enough people to bury the dead in a lot of places. And so there was also a lot of looking for scapegoats. Like the Jews were made into scapegoats. People were saying, oh, it's their fault or they caused it. They poisoned people or something like that. And it was all bunk, of course. But it was this time of intense fear. It felt like the world was coming to an end, which I think we can sympathize with. But yeah, there was just this feeling that like death was everywhere, and maybe you got to think about heaven more because a lot of people are gonna die. Now the weird thing is that this had some effects that might have actually been in the longest term positive, not in like the near term, but over maybe the next few decades after the plague. These guys actually experienced an economic boom because there was a lack of people to fill the jobs that were going around. So a lot of people managed to move up in society. A lot of jobs needed to be filled. So things actually picked up quite a bit after that. Unfortunately, that was due to a lot of death. So maybe that's not the best option. But something to think about how these weird effects can happen. But one theory about the end of the Middle Ages is that there's a huge boom in population growth after the plague, and that changes the nature of things. But on the other hand, there was also gradual growth throughout the Middle Ages, and there kind of needed to be a certain amount of growth for the plague to even be able to spread. The cities needed to be a certain amount big. So maybe it just kind of accelerated a process that was already there. But that was definitely the end of an era in a lot of ways. Another thing that sort of brought an era to an end was the Magna Carta. This was the first time, this is a document from England, that was the first time there had really been a clear agreement between the nobles and the king. So the nobles said the king is not allowed to do this, X, Y, and Z, and the king signed that document and agreed to it. So this was like an important step on the road to democracy, which people think is pretty cool. This was in the 1200s. And of course, we got to talk about the Protestants. You might have heard of this guy, Martin Luther. Here he is depicted looking very serious, possibly a little bit smug. He was originally a member of the Catholic Church, like most people in Europe were, but he objected to some things that they were doing. For instance, indulgences. If you pay enough money, the Pope decides that you get to go to heaven. Well, that's not cool, said Martin Luther. There were various other objections, like the way people talked about purgatory, and you could also pay your way out of purgatory. And in general, there was just a feeling that having this church as an authority controlling everyone's lives was not a good thing, and that there should be more independence from one overarching authority. And so the famous story is that Martin Luther wrote 95 theses, 95 ideas about how to fix the church, and he just pinned them to the big church door so everyone could see them, and so the priests all had to look at them. Now, this may not have happened, but it sort of shows the sort of mood that he was in. Basically, reject the idea of this hierarchical church. And for Martin Luther, it was all about God's individual connection with each person. And there was also a lot more emphasis on hell rather than purgatory. God either likes you or he doesn't. And you don't get to have a middle ground. But your religion should be entirely based on your faith and your relationship with God. That was Martin Luther's big idea. Another big idea connected to this was that the Bible should be readable by everybody. So before, you had these priests who were reading it in Latin, and they knew what it said, but most people weren't learning Latin. They spoke all these other languages. So in a big way, Martin Luther was able to get the common people on his side because he said, hey, you can finally read this and know what it's all about. He's a complicated figure. Some of his writings, you have to wrestle with the fact that he was very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic in some of them. But then a lot of people in religion were at the time. Anyway, so he establishes this, and people start breaking away from the Catholic Church and starting their own Protestant Christian movements, a lot of which are the Protestant religions that we know today, Protestant Christian movements. And so this is a map of how things shake out. So you have some countries that are Roman Catholic and some countries that are Protestant. England is pretty significant because England's culture is really influential on the founding of America. And the type of Christianity that we think of in America most commonly is the Protestant kind. And so that informs a lot of our assumptions on what Christianity even is on like a background level. So it's important to think about that type of stuff. So this was going to shape the world, because if the Middle Ages were defined by the Roman Catholic Church being so powerful in this part of Europe, then the future was going to be defined by that no longer being the case. And there were wars over this stuff. Like, people wanted to figure out who was right and who was wrong, and to get their opinion out there and to conquer their enemies if they had to get the right idea as they saw it into the world and believed. And the reason England became so Protestant was just because King Henry VIII, in large part, wanted to divorce his wife. So he started his own church, which was very similar to the Roman Catholic Church, but had slightly different rules and was Protestant, which is kind of interesting that so much of our culture could be shaped by that. Another big change was the printing press. And in some ways, the printing press really helped people like Martin Luther and the other Protestants along because, just like I said with China, a printing press allows you to spread ideas really fast. So people aren't just sort of enduring. People are, waiting for ideas to reach them over a long period of time. People are changing their minds much more quickly when they have flyers and documents to read that are proclaiming new ideas. And Gutenberg, he printed Bibles, but that goes to show what people were going to be concerned about. First it was Bibles, then it was discussion around the Bibles and new ideas about what religion should be. That was going to be influential. And having the printing press made the world much more interconnected in general. So that's a big deal. And of course, we got to mention the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is an Italian word that means rebirth. Basically, a good summary of it would be that a certain group of Italians, and to be fair, they were mostly rich and upper class and whatnot, but they were interested in bringing back all the Greek and Roman stuff. This started in the 1300s. They felt for that period of 800 to 1,000 years, the Middle Ages had neglected the Greek and Roman stuff and not really properly appreciated it. There were a lot of cool concepts in there, a lot of cool mythology, a lot of cool art and sculpture, and basically they thought they were living in a rebirth of everything that was important in the world, and so they wanted to bring back philosophy and art and architecture. And to be fair, they did a lot of cool things with their art that was basically building on the achievements of the Greeks and Romans, whereas things hadn't quite been building on that. It had been mostly church architecture up until that point, and they said, well, let's make beautiful buildings for their own sake, and let's talk about philosophy. And remember Socrates? Did you forget about him? Let's talk about him again. And yeah, this might have been isolated just to the rich people, but eventually these ideas would kind of trickle out, and we're still pretty influenced by them today. For instance, the style of Greek sculpture that they really liked was the old Athenian style of Greek sculpture and not the Hellenistic style. So that was considered the best style up until relatively recently when we started rethinking some of that stuff. But yeah, if you tend to think that the Middle Ages was a dark age in human history, then you might think that the Renaissance is the time where everything gets to be great again. And there's some things you could say about that, but I think we should be careful to not make too many assumptions about that, and also to know that the Renaissance time was pretty different from our own in a lot of ways, even though we might want to say that's the same as our own. But it is a great time for art. We got Michelangelo, we got Leonardo da Vinci doing all the science. It's a great time for science. And of course, we've got people exploring and sailing. So this is when Europeans start trying to conquer other parts of the world. In 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. And this is the end of things for both Europe and for the Americas. For Europe, it's up to their system to find there are other people around out there who they've never encountered before, and they've never even heard of Jesus. That is wild. That is mind-blowing to a lot of Western Europeans. And inversely, it's kind of an apocalypse for a lot of the local cultures like the Inca, the Maya, the Aztec cultures. Like you might have heard, disease spread rapidly through the Native American populations, and that was a big part of how their societies fell apart, including folks like the Aztecs. And then came the Europeans conquering and, enslaving, a lot of stuff after that. So it was the end of an era. Was a time when a lot of things changed, like the foods that people could get were different. For instance, can you imagine Italy without tomato sauce? Can you imagine Italy without tomatoes, or the Irish without potatoes? Those things weren't there until they came over from the Americas. The Europeans imported them and then made them an important part of their diet and culture. So yeah, that was a big change as well. Then there were the conquerors conquering the Aztecs, the Inca, and the Maya. In China, the conquerors were the Mongols, a group I don't really have time to go into too much here, but they were horse-riding people who conquered a lot of people, including China. And they didn't end up changing the culture too much in China. They just kind of took over and said, yeah, we're going to do everything the Chinese emperors did. So they had their own dynasty, and they brought the old dynasty to an end, but they acted pretty similarly. Empire. It's pretty impressive, but it doesn't last for very long. It splinters, and then, in a way, things go back to the way they were before, just ruled by different leaders. They take over the Islamic world and end the caliphate, but the rulers are still Islamic, and again, China is still pretty similar to China. So that's basically the end of this time period. And hopefully that gives you some food for thought going forward. If you want to look more into this, there's more classes you can take.